Hey there, Cold Warriors. It's the Bearded Wonder here for another video. This time we're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the first thing we need to talk about is Cuba. Uh, we're going to break down the word here, or the title, Cuban Missile Crisis. So let's talk about Cuba for a second here. We see these two young men in the left-hand picture here. These are Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Both of them are communists. Che Guevara is a communist revolutionary. He had been running all over South America, basically trying to promote communist revolutions. For the most part, failed, wasn't really that popular, so he ends up in Cuba. Fidel Castro is not really, he's kind of a communist, but more than anything, he's about getting control of the country. And so communism is a really convenient way to do that. And so he kind of supports the communist revolution. What we're definitely talking about here is two guys that are pretty violent, not necessarily people that you would want running for president of the United States. But they get support from the Soviets, mainly because they're communist and they don't really care about much else. The Americans kind of briefly dabble in anti-revolutionary activities. They try to help the people that are against the revolution, maybe even do more harm than good to their own cause by supporting people that aren't really good or freedom-loving people themselves. This is kind of a common theme in these proxy war kind of situations. And basically the result is that Cuba becomes a communist country. So that's the Cuban part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The next thing is the missile part. So basically the Soviets decide to help out Cuba by putting nuclear missiles inside of Cuba. This is popular with the Castros, obviously helps Fidel maintain control of his country, kind of resist pressure from the United States, who might be trying to come in and turn it back into a non-communist country. And so he's good with that. Why would we want to put missiles in Cuba? Well, if you look at our kind of Cold War map here, what you notice is that America has a lot of nuclear missiles, land-based missiles, around the Soviet Union. You've got some in Japan. Japan is occupied by the United States after World War II. Also, you have some in Germany, also occupied by America after World War II, and Turkey, which is a NATO ally of America after World War II. And so they kind of have the Soviet Union surrounded. The Soviet Union has none anywhere close to America. So if they can kind of convince the Cubans to be cool with putting missiles there, obviously you can look at the map here and see that that would be a big advantage to the Soviets, a strategic advantage. It would give them a little bit more of a level playing field. And so now we get to the crisis part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've got two leaders. Nikita Khrushchev is the man here on the left, the Soviet premier, the leader. Joseph Stalin has died and been succeeded by Khrushchev. And JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States. And so we have these missiles in Cuba. The United States first has to discover them, because it's not like the Soviets put up billboards saying, hey, we have missiles here. And so a United States spy plane kind of flies over Cuba. They come back with pictures, and the pictures basically show that, yes, the Soviets are building nuclear missiles in Cuba. And not just a few, but enough that it's pretty much a threat to the Americans. This is the way the Soviets mean it to be taken. And so now we've got to deal with this. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis takes about 13 days from the time the Americans discover the missiles to the time they are dealt with. So the first thing is the Americans basically try to come up with a response. And their first response is going to be to put a blockade in place. Basically, they're going to use their navy to shut down Cuba from the rest of the world. Now, this doesn't deal with the missiles that are already there, but it does deal with missiles elsewhere. And now they've got a couple of options. They can try to put pressure on Cuba to make Cuba insist that the missiles are gone. Probably not going to happen. Castro is not going to be likely to go for a plan like that. They could just nuke Cuba and the missile sites, and that would get rid of them. But now you risk that mutually assured destruction scenario where the Soviet Union might attack you back. Not really a good one either. And so what JFK kind of decides to do is to try to negotiate instead. And what he doesn't know, but what is the case, is that the Soviets have kind of overplayed their hand as well. They don't want to risk that nuclear war any more than the United States does. So, how do we solve this problem? Well, basically, the United States floats this idea that if the Soviets were willing to take their missiles out of Cuba, then basically the Soviets would need to get something in return, and the Americans are kind of looking at the fact that they have these missiles all over the world, and they basically decide that they're willing to move the ones in Turkey. And not right away. That would make it seem like they're negotiating with a dangerous person. They don't want to do that, so it's kind of a delayed response, but they kind of agree to that. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, which takes about 13 days, ends without anybody launching missiles at each other. The Soviets take their missiles out of Cuba because they're being a little bit flexible, and so are the United States. And we get away from this nuclear war situation. And that kind of leaves us with the modern day, or at least until a couple years ago, kind of situation in Cuba where Fidel Castro is kind of there. They're communist, but they're also being shut off from the rest of the world. The United States has a trade embargo with Cuba. You're not allowed to buy things from Cuba in the United States until a couple of years ago. And basically for the next 40 or 50 years, they're just going to be kind of there by themselves. That's it for our presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a nice day.